SpaceX is gearing up for Starship's 5th flight, with double-chopstick catch testing on the pad whilst preparing the vehicles for flight. We've also got a ton of hardware moving around Starbase, including some peculiar looking parts that we'll explain in detail. I mean, what on earth does Starship need this kettle-looking thing for? We've got all of that and more in this Starbase update, sponsored by Novium. As I said in the intro, there was a lot of hardware moving around Starbase, and one of those pieces of hardware was none other than Ship 26. Yep, our controversial friend went out for a little walk from the rocket garden to Mega Bay 2. There it was installed on the center workstation, and over the following day, workers started removing its 6 engines. These 6 engines had serial numbers 205, 212 and 202 for the Raptor vacuum engines, and serial numbers 195, 193 and 198 for the Sea Level Raptor engines at the center. As you can see in some of this footage, these Raptors are definitely not looking pristine. They were installed on this vehicle all the way back in March of last year, which tells you all you need to know for how long this vehicle has been around. We actually thought that Ship 26 would not be around for much longer though, since normally removing engines from a ship is what SpaceX tends to do before scrapping it. But unfortunately, SpaceX removed it from the workstation in Mega Bay 2 and then moved it back to the rocket garden. That means that all of the fans of Ship 26 can now breathe a sigh of relief, as this vehicle, despite all the odds, has still not been scrapped. At least for now. Amongst the pieces of hardware that we've seen rolling this week were modules 7 and 8 of the second launch tower at Starbase. These have been prepared for the roll and stacking for the last 2 weeks or so, and were rolled from Sanchez all the way to the launch site for said stacking, but we'll get onto that in a second. This means only one module remains at Sanchez, and that is Module 9, also known as the roof of the tower. This section has had work being done on it for the last couple of weeks as well, to prepare it for rollout and installation, but as of this recording, that roll has not yet occurred. However, there is a road closure scheduled for the early hours of Monday morning for a transport between Sanchez and the pad. That looks like it might be for this move. This means that by the time you're watching, perhaps Module 9 will be already at the launch site and being prepared for stacking. That also means that for our next Starbase update, we will finally have another fully stacked tower at Starbase. All of these tower module rolls wouldn't have happened though if it hadn't been for the big CC8800-1 crane at the pad being readied for all the stackings. But first,
this video was sponsored by Novium. They make really nifty, magnetically hovering pens that are inspired by space and are a great way to have an artful little reminder of the coolness of weightlessness in any workspace. Weightlessness is one of the coolest things about spaceflight to me, and one of the things that I would personally most like to experience. So of course, I love these pens. The Interstellar edition has a tilt of 23.5 degrees, which is reminiscent of the Earth's axis of rotation. It comes in a bunch of cool colors like Neptune Blue, Starlight Silver, and Mars Magma. Plus, they also have premium editions made of 18-karat gold, and they even have one with a real meteorite embedded in the pen. I personally really like the look of the Future edition, which features an optional interchangeable tip, so you can switch between a rollerball or a fountain tip, depending on whatever you're feeling at the moment. I mean, just look at that spin. It's not only a high-end pen that writes really well, it's an endlessly satisfying addition to any desk. Plus, they're a great gift for anyone you might care about. Use code NSF to get 10% off and free shipping on all hover pens. And click the link in the description so Novium knows we sent you. Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video and for making a cool product.
if you remember from our last episode, the giant CC8800-1 crane at the launch site had an incident while crews were trying to raise it after its reconfiguration. That reconfiguration had to be done in order to lift the remaining tower modules for Tower 2, but, well, that incident did delay things a bit. The incident apparently had to do with an outrigger on the crane that got damaged while crews were raising the boom. After the incident, the crane was lowered again and the outriggers were removed, including the damaged one. A new one was installed shortly after and the crane was raised again, this time with no issues. With the crane back in action, SpaceX was able to attach it to Module 7 and stack it onto the rest of the tower. As we now know from the previous 6 modules, this process doesn't take too long, and by the next day, SpaceX had already rolled Module 8 and had the load spreader attached to this tower section. In fact, stacking of Module 8 happened just today, right before recording, less than 48 hours after Module 7 was stacked. That just goes to show how quickly SpaceX is moving with all of this. You may notice from these shots that these two modules are a bit shorter than the rest of the modules that are underneath them. While modules 1 to 6 all have 3 levels, modules 7 and 8 only have 2. This is different from Tower 1 and the launch tower at LC-39A in Florida, where modules 1 to 7 were all the same size and all had 3 levels, while module 8 was just one single level. Some quick mathematics shows that despite this change, the height of all the sections stacked on top of each other is exactly the same. It's just been rearranged differently for sections 7 and 8. This rearrangement probably has to do with the fact that these are the modules nearest to the top, and it becomes more difficult for the crane to lift heavier sections like the ones with 3 levels instead of 1 or 2. Prior to these two modules being stacked, we also saw teams testing the new lights on Tower 2. These also differ from the ones we see on Tower 1 and the one at 39A. While on Tower 1 the lights are only on the section for the quick disconnect arm, the base of the tower and the top of the tower, it looks like Tower 2 will have lights on all sections. These aren't the big flashing lights that ruin our Starbase live views of the pad at night, these are just normal lights for workers being able to see when it's dark. Do you remember when Tower 1 had lights of different colours to indicate different statuses like pad open, pad closed, lightning in the area and whatnot? That didn't seem to last for long though. With all of this being said, we're dreading the moment SpaceX turns on the big flashing lights on Tower 2. That'll be another annoyance we'll have to deal with for our live cameras. Jack and Mary might also be forced into taking long exposures anytime they're taking photos at night. We'll just have to wait and see. Fingers crossed it's not that bad, but yeah. Whilst all this tower work has been ongoing, SpaceX has continued to work on the foundations for the flame trench at Pad B. This work has consisted lately of installing the sheet piles around the perimeter of the future trench. These sheet piles help to keep the ground around the work area stable so that teams are able to dig into the ground to create the trench. SpaceX employed a very similar process while upgrading the foundations on the current OLM after Starship's first flight. Teams installed a lot of these sheet piles around the area they were going to work on and then dug on the inside to work on reinforcing the foundations, work that included tons and tons of rebar and concrete to finish. Literally. If you thought we'd already hit all the hardware moves in this week's Starbase update, you would be wrong. This week we also had a test tank moving to Massey's from the production site. This is the test tank that we believe will serve as a structural test article for the aft section of Starship version 2. We covered that in a recent episode because this isn't the first time this test tank rolled to Massey's. Back then, it was placed on the newly built structural test stand, but then it was removed after just some cryogenic testing and then rolled back into the Star Factory. As we also explained back then, we haven't found the label or name for this test tank, so right now we're just referring to it as Test Tank 16, since it is the 16th test tank to be built, and Test Tank 16 is easier to say than the 16th test tank every single time. Test Tank 16 stayed inside the Star Factory, being worked on for a few weeks, at least until this week when it rolled out to Massey's, likely to continue with its test campaign. We'll see what SpaceX ends up doing with it, but it could give them a lot of information about the build quality of the upcoming version 2 design. And speaking of the version 2 design, this week we had more progress on Ship 33 stacking. In case you don't remember, this vehicle is the first version 2 ship. This new version has been enlarged by 1 ring, and its tanks have been rearranged and extended so as to hold more propellant in detriment of a shorter payload bay section. In order to understand this, let's take a look at how many rings and barrels make up these ships. On the current ships, the vehicles have the nose cone and 5 barrel sections below, which are the payload bay section made up of 5 rings, the forward dome section made up of 3 rings, and then the common dome section, the mid-lock section, and the aft section, all with 4 rings. On version 2 ships, there are now 6 barrel sections underneath the nose cone, the payload bay section now with only 3 rings, the forward dome section with 4 rings, the common dome section with 3 rings, a 3-ring section for the top of the LOX tank, a 4-ring section for the bottom of the LOX tank, and another 4-ring section for the aft section of the ship. If you're still with me and can do the maths, you can see what I explained before. The number of rings has only been increased by 1 on version 2, but the tanks have been stretched further up. All of these explanations have a reason to exist in this episode, and that's because that's the part that SpaceX stacked this week, the section for the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank. So now you'll be able to understand that what this means is that we've seen all of Ship 33 sections welded together except for the aft section. Once that's done, stacking of the vehicle will be complete, and SpaceX will be able to work on all of the little things like tiles, the piping, installing the aft flaps, and a whole lot more, although, to be honest, none of those components are really that small. Small in terms of Starship scale. I definitely cannot wait to see a completed version 2 ship rolling out of Mega Bay 2 and moving out for its first cryogenic proof test. We'll be able to spot all of the changes from big to small, and you can bet we'll be making a video just about that alone. There's going to be a lot to learn. You may now be wondering, because version 2 ships are only one ring taller, could the nose cone also be taller? Well, so far that is not the case. The nose cones are still the same height as before. In fact, Mary spotted this week 2 new nose cones for version 2 ships inside of the Star Factory. We can see one of them is a little bit ahead on the production line relative to the other, as it has pins for the heat shield tiles already installed. Since no labels are visible, we're not sure for what ship these may be, but it could be for any of the immediately upcoming vehicles, such as Ship 34, 35, 36, or perhaps even beyond that. Continuing with even more version 2 ship hardware spotted around Starbase, this week we saw this weird kettle-looking piece of hardware staged near the entrance to the production site. In case you don't know, this isn't so the astronauts on board Starship can make some tea, this is a methane header tank for the new versions of ships. And we know this not only because the geometry works pretty well with the new design for the ship's liquid oxygen header tank, but also because there's a label on it saying S34CH4HT, which translated into English means Ship 34 Methane Header Tank. If it looks weird, that's because it is. It's not good looking, let's be honest. But another reason is also because it's upside down. The truncated cone at the bottom is actually the top of this tank, and it is a supporting structure that is welded inside of the ship's nose cone. In fact, you can see this weld line on the version 2 nose cones that Mary had spotted inside the Star Factory. This support structure replaces an old set of trusses and allows SpaceX to install composite overwrapped pressure vessels, or COPVs, on it and simplify the installation of the header tanks on Starship. Now, while it does say Ship 34 on it, we think this might have been the header tank originally assigned to Ship 34, but not the one that is actually being installed in its nose cone. The reason for that is because this tank is no longer at Starbase. It was trucked off from the side out to SpaceX's McGregor test facility. Our friend Blair spotted the tank arriving at SpaceX's facilities after it had left Starbase. It is very possible that SpaceX will be testing this header tank at McGregor just like they've tested other tanks in the past. In fact, even to this day, they keep testing weird looking tanks, which are also likely to be related to Starship development. Whenever we happen to spot them, they appear on McGregor Live. All of that work is for future ships, but there's also been work on the next ship to fly, Ship 30. If you remember from last week's episode, this ship is now at Sanchez after completing a series of engine tests at Massey's following engine swaps and whatnot. This week, teams finally installed the vehicle decals on Ship 30, which is another sign that it is very close to launching. This was a bit unexpected, as Ship 29 did not get any decals prior to flying, despite Ships 24, 25 and 28 receiving them. We thought that SpaceX had discontinued this practice, but thankfully for us, that was not the case. This was a surprise, but it's a welcome one. I'm also thankful that they placed the decals in the correct orientation this time. This week, Ship 30 also received more attention to its heat shield tiles, with lifts going up, inspecting and replacing suspect tiles. We've also been able to spot even more tiles that have been installed on the gap between the forward flaps of Ship 30 and the hinge. These are likely there in order to protect the body of the flap from any burn-throughs this time around, compared to what happened on Ship 29. If plasma ends up going through the gap like last time, at least the flap may still hold structural integrity for longer with the extra tiles there. Even though SpaceX has proven they can perform a soft water splashdown with a chunk of the forward flap missing, SpaceX aims for Starship to be a fully reusable vehicle without requiring a new flap on every flight. This isn't the only ship receiving special attention to its heat shield, however. Another week has passed, which means work continues on the orbital launch, force of habit, Ship 31's heat shield. Just like we saw with Ship 30, it'll take a few weeks of hard work to completely replace Ship 31's heat shield with the new and improved tiles and install the backup ablative material underneath. For now though, the work is focused more on removing tiles, and it seems as if not as many workers are participating in this overhaul, so perhaps it'll take a bit longer than Ship 30's. Of course, Ship 31's own flight is further down the line, so they're not as in much of a hurry and can take a little bit of extra time to get it right. Another place where more progress has been made has been the connection between the Star Factory and the office building. Many more beams and trusses have been installed for this connection, and we'll definitely keep an eye on its progress to see what it ends up looking like. The office building itself has also seen a lot more progress as well, with now 2 stories of windows completed and a bunch of internal hardware installed as well. Now let's go back to the launch site, where we've not only had more Tower 2 stacking, but also, yes, you guessed it, another hardware move. I told you there'd be lots of those. Do you remember that container at the launch site where SpaceX would store the flight termination system charges? Well, it isn't at the launch site anymore. In fact, it's not even at Starbase anymore. For some strange reason, SpaceX trucked it outside of the launch site, carried it up Highway 4, and it simply left without even saying goodbye. We don't know why this was done or what will happen in the future with the FTS charges, but we'll just have to wait and see. Personally, I did always find it slightly amusing that the explosives powerful enough to destroy an entire Starship vehicle were stored mere meters from the very pad that it departed from. While SpaceX has been constantly working on Tower 2, Tower 1 also received some attention this week. We've seen crews installing new doublers on the connections between horizontal and diagonal beams on the bottom section of the tower. It looks like these doublers are larger and of course newer than the ones that had been there in the first place. This is yet another piece of work that we're not entirely sure on why it was done, but one could probably guess it has something to do with reinforcing the bottom of the tower even more than it is right now. Of course, the big piece of work that's been going on this week at Pad A has been the slap testing, but before all of that could happen, SpaceX had been working for the previous week on the chopsticks and installed new and upgraded shock absorption pads on the landing rails of the arms. We mentioned this installation last week, but it happened overnight, so we had to wait until the morning for Mary to capture shots like this one of that said padding. It turns out that this padding foam is now covered in metal, which prevents the foam from getting ablated after each catch. The pads also contain springs that probably help to restore the shape of the metal cover after the catch. So with all of that completed and installed, SpaceX proceeded to test the chopsticks with the B-14.1 test tank. A couple of months ago, these tests only involved one single arm, the northernmost of the two, because that was the only one they had been upgrading. With both arms now upgraded, the tests involved both of them. Just like the previous time around, some of these consisted of just raising the landing rail and then lifting the chopsticks under the lifting pins, pressing against them to put a force on the rails similar to that of the landing. These tests therefore are aimed at testing the amount of compression on the rails and their shock absorption system. But of course, the tests that everyone always pays attention to are the ones where B-14.1 gets slapped over and over and over again. And this time it was with both arms. While the other set of tests were all about the landing rail, these were all about the timing and precision of the movement of the chopsticks. After all, the arms need to be in the right location and be closed at the correct rate in order to catch a booster right as it is coming in for landing without hitting a fragile portion of said vehicle. From what we could see, the closing of the chopsticks appears to take around 9 seconds, and this timing can help us have an idea of how fast Booster 12 will be going when SpaceX attempts its catch on the upcoming flight. In order to do that though, we do need to make some assumptions, and the first one is about the speed of the booster as it touches down on the chopsticks. It's very likely that the booster may still carry some small velocity, but by all means this can just be rounded down to 0 when doing the maths. Don't worry, we won't show it here. There's no need to be scared. Another assumption relates to when the chopsticks start to close. The arms may start to close just as the booster's aft end is starting to go through them, or it could be that they start to close earlier and the booster tries to thread the needle. Based on this, Alex made this graph showing what the average thrust to weight ratio of the booster has to be, depending on when in the process the booster starts to go through the chopsticks. For example, if we assume that the chopsticks close as the engines are just about to pass through them, then that would be a travel time of 9 seconds, which corresponds to a thrust to weight ratio of 1.15. This is very, very close to a hover. Under this assumption then, the booster would have a very little speed as it comes in between the chopsticks, which is a good thing if SpaceX wants to keep them intact. Things turn more risky though if we assume that the booster starts to go through the chopsticks later in the process. For example, if we assume that the booster goes through the arms in the last 3 seconds of the process, the average thrust to weight ratio jumps to 2.5. This is likely the maximum possible value for this, with just 3 engines firing at full power, as it translates into a booster mass at landing of about 270 metric tons, and that's more or less what we're expecting. All of this is to say that the landing may either look very gentle or very, very scary. Either way, excitement is certainly guaranteed. If you have any other assumptions on how it may go, leave them down in the comments. Since we're still a few more weeks out from that catch attempt, it's very likely SpaceX may still try to do more testing on the pad before that happens. B14.1 has now been removed from the OLM and rolled back to the production side, which means the orbital launch mount is free. If you remember from last week, we theorised that perhaps SpaceX could have enough time to roll booster 13 to the launch site and perform a static fire of this vehicle before Flight 5 takes place. As a reminder, that's Flight 6's booster. Of course, another option for SpaceX now is to roll booster 12 and ship 30 to the pad and stack them and get them fully ready before flight. As always, the only way to find out is to just wait and see. Thanks to Novium for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use code NSF or click the link in the description for 10% off and free shipping on all hover pens. I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.